Today's Wednesday. That's on the third.
Awesome.
What's that? Yes. All right. Let me start by returning some graded scale form from last time we met. So, last time we met, which was, I believe, before Easter break, I had made a slight adjustment to the assignment sheet saying that we don't really have anything to do today because I did not get as far as I wanted to last class, and it was pretty impossible to get as far as I was planning on it. So, today I'd like to go through, last class we talked about two types of pentatonic scales. The major pentatonic scale and the minor pentatonic scale. Does anyone remember which 5 scale steps or scale degrees do you use to spell any major? Yeah, I think it's 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6. And then to spell the minor pentatonic scale, which 5 scale steps do we draw from the natural motion scale? 1, 3, 4, 5, 7. Sounds right. Very good. And that has to be from a natural minor scale. So since there's no homework to go over, and I do want to get through whole tone scales, I want to get through octatonic scales, and I want to get through hexatonic scales. And no, I'm not making these names up. So I want to get through these 3 scales, and then you should have sufficient information to do several more pages in your workbook. Several more pages in your workbook for homework. Okay. Incidentally, does anyone know if there's starting to be another, how do I say this, another little uptick in illnesses? Because I had 2 emails from 2 students this morning saying that they just want to be sure that they're not, they had some symptoms, that kind of thing. And I see Haley's not here. I guess it's awesome.
And also like the huge change in weather next to
Yes.
so big.
There was some yesterday was a hot day.
Yeah, well, I guess, I'm okay, not that it's good anyways, I'm okay if people are regularly sick, I'm hoping we don't get another round of COVID. Yeah. I mean, if it's just your normal colds, kind of allergy, that's,
Allocated for like a big October.
Okay. All right, let's start then by talking about something called a synthetic scale. I'm not going to make you memorize what a synthetic scale is or hold you responsible for it. I just want you to know that a synthetic scale is kind of a made-up or a fabricated scale that's designed for a specific piece with a desired size. Okay? A synthetic scale is kind of the term that's opposite of what's called diatonic scales. The diatonic scales are known as the major and minor scales, and the church modes that we've been talking about, and even the pentatonic scales are considered diatonic. Bless you. are considered diatonic scales. This synthetic scale term, it encompasses a class of scales that are kind of made up or designed or fabricated with a particular purpose in mind. And really, the available variety of synthetic scales is limited only by a composer's imagination. So you could devise, you could come up with any kind of scale you wanted. Whether it's a 3-note scale, 4-note scale, 5-note scale, 6-note scale, half steps, whole steps, major thirds in between pitches, minor, you can just, anything you could think of to devise, I guess, would be classified into the big heading synthetic scale. But we're going to look at 3 particular synthetic scales that the 20th century composers came up with and that they liked a lot and that they used a lot as source material for their 20th century pieces, for their music. Okay. So the 3 most common synthetic scales are the following. And I should be talking about these in this order. First is known as the whole tone scale. Second is known as the octatonic scale. And lastly is known as the hexatonic scale. And of these 3, I would say, in my experience, I see composers use the hexatonic scale the least often. I think this one is encountered very infrequently compared to pieces that are based off of these top 2 scales here. These are very widespread. Scale and the octatonic scale. So, I don't know if when you woke up this morning you thought, hey, I'm going to learn some music scales today, but that's exactly what we're going to do. Let's start with the whole tone scale. The whole tone scale is a 6-note scale. And when I say 6-note scale, I mean that there are 6 different pitches. I'm not including the octave duplicated pitch at the end. Just like if we talk about the major and the minor scales, those are really 7-note scales. There's really only 7 different pitches, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. I don't count the octave duplication, the do, and the at the end. So the whole tone scale that only has 6 different pitches. And it's built entirely out of whole steps, hence the name whole tone scale. So the distance between each scale degree in a whole tone scale is a whole step. So let's spell a whole tone scale starting on C. And I'm going to get another marker pretty soon. This one's starting to fade. So a whole step above C is D. A whole step above D is E. A whole step above E is F sharp. A whole step above F sharp is G sharp. A whole step above G sharp is A sharp, and a whole step above A sharp is B sharp, which is enharmonic with C. So it's like dividing the octave, which is filled with 12 chromatic pitches. It's like dividing the octave into even whole steps, so that you get 6 scale degrees instead of 7 or 8 or other ones. Okay? So, one of the main things you need to know about the whole tone scale, of course, is that it's built entirely out of major seconds or whole steps. Every single scale degree is a whole step away. Now, when you spell the whole tone scale, at some point in the scale, you have to spell one of these whole steps or major seconds enharmonically as a diminished third. You see how A sharp to C, technically that is not a major second but a diminished third. Yeah, you have to do that at some point in the scale so that you don't end up with a different starting pitch. I mean, you'll end up with the same pitch, you don't want it to be spelled differently than the first pitch. Okay? So, let's see here, how am I going to do this? I guess we can do this as a diminished third interval, though, is enharmonic with a whole step or a major second. Now, when you spell a whole tone scale, any of these synthetic scales for that matter, you can use whatever spelling of these pitches, enharmonic spelling of these pitches that you want. You are not restricted to using like C, D, E, F sharp, G sharp, A sharp, C. you could spell it C, D, E, G flat, A flat, B flat, C. You could do that. It's because they're enharmonic, but they're still a whole step apart. Okay? So how do I want to say this? Enharmonic spellings of any notes in these three scales is permitted. Except I don't want you to enharmonically spell the octave duplicating pitch of D. I like you to end on the same spelling you start with. So in other words, I'm not going to end with B sharp. Because I started with C and I'm going to end with C. But any of the notes in the middle of the scale you can spell enharmonically. That's totally fine. Okay, now, because there are no half steps in the whole tone scale, there are no leading tones. That's kind of weird. In tonal music, we rely and depend upon so heavily. We rely and talk about leading tones all the time. We talk about T. We talk about how leading tones help define tonalities and keys and things like that. They help you define where tonic is and that kind of thing. And this scale has no leading tones. The only type of triad that can be built from the scale is the augmented triad. Isn't that weird? Let's take a few examples, like for instance, C, E, G sharp. That's an augmented triad. You can actually build an augmented triad starting on any scale. So D, F sharp, A sharp is an augmented triad. E, G sharp, and B sharp, aka C, is an augmented triad. You get the idea. So the only type to be triad type that can be constructed from this scale is the augmented triad. Now, the scale, if you want to think of, besides thinking of the whole tone scale as a 6-note scale whose notes are all a major second or a whole step apart, you can also look at the whole tone scale as a scale with two interlocking augmented triads separated by a whole step. Now, what on earth does that mean? Well, let's see if I can use maybe a different color. And I don't know if any of these colors are going to work, but let's give it a try. There's an augmented triad marked by the blue, right? C, E, G sharp. Here is another augmented triad marked by the black. D, F sharp, and A sharp. You see how there's two augmented triads that are kind of interlocking, kind of like teeth almost in a way, and they're separated by a whole step. So that's another way to think of it if you want to the whole tone scale. I personally think it's a little easier just to remember it's a 6-note scale with full steps between every scale. That's why it's called a whole tone scale. But if you want to look at it as two interlocking augmented triads separated by a whole step, you can. Okay, the whole tone scale contains an abundance of tritone intervals. C to F sharp, that's a tritone. D to G sharp is a tritone. E to A sharp is a tritone. So on and so forth. So it's got a lot of tritones. There are no possibilities, though, for traditional resolution of that dissonant interval in this scale. You might have tritones between two pitches, but you can't resolve the tritone to a constant. No, traditionally. There are no perfect, I guess I should say, there are no perfect intervals. There's no perfect fourths. There's no perfect fifths. Hence, there's no major or minor triads possible to spell out of these notes. You can't even get standard major or minor triads. Okay, besides augmented triads, let's find a few other chords that we know of, that we've learned, that can be built or constructed using notes with the whole tone scale. Believe it or not, a incomplete 5/7 can be built using the notes of the whole tone scale. If, for instance, you think of the A sharp enharmonically as B flat, we can get C, E, and B flat, which is almost a full 5/7. It's just missing the G. It's almost a full dominant 7th chord. We can also get out of the whole tone scale the 5/7 flat 5. Remember that chord? we can get the 5/7 sharp 5. And we can get the French 6 chord. Because these chords that I've listed here can be built using the notes of the whole tone scale, these chords in 20th century music, they're sometimes referred to as whole tone chords. Whole tone chords. Whole tone chords. A whole tone chord, by definition, is just any chord that you can get and that you can build or spell using just the notes of the whole tone scale. So, the altered dominance, augmented triad, the French 6, these are known in 20th century music as whole tone chords. Is there anything else I forgot about the whole tone scale? No, that might be enough. Does anyone have any questions, first of all, about the whole tone scale? Give me a minute or two to connect to the Wi-Fi system here, and I want to see if I can play an example out of your textbook that is based on the whole tone scale. It sounds really weird. Right, I forget which page it comes out of your book, it doesn't matter. But just, it's a short example, just listen to the sound, the style of this music, something that's based off of a strange scale, not a major, minor scale or mode, but this strange whole tone scale.
26/9.
Isn't that weird? Sound? That's actually a piece by Todd Gibbs. It's a piece called, so I don't even know how to pronounce the French. Let me write the French out. What's the French term? How's that pronounced? Translation in English, it's talking about sails on a boat. Sails. And it's a piece just where, well, it's actually a three-part piece. The outer A sections are based on a whole tone scale, and I think the middle section is based on a black key pentatonic scale. But yeah, it's really far out there. It's really different sounding than a lot of things we've been listening to and learning for the past 3 semesters. I don't know, some people have a real liking for this kind of music. Some people maybe not so much. They're not too crazy about this kind of music. Usually people are strongly one way or the other, not usually in the middle. I guess I can hear it as well. Let's see, let's just leave that there. Okay, so there's the whole tone scale. Let's just try practice spelling a whole tone scale on a different pitch besides C. because I know you're going to be asked to spell some whole tone scales for your homework. And, oh, I don't know. Let's try to spell a whole tone scale on A flat. Okay, 6 different pitches, all a whole step apart. Somewhere at one point, somewhere in the scale, you're going to have to spell the 2 notes of the scale have to be a diminished third. And remind what the meaning is. So let's go, what's a whole step above A flat? B flat, and a whole step above B flat? C, and a whole step above C? D, and then a whole step? E, and then a whole step? F sharp. And then a whole step above F sharp is G sharp, which is A flat. You can just end up with the same next step. And there you have another whole tone scale. All right, maybe I can play this still. I'll just play one to see since it's easier than others. There you have that. Let's talk about the octatonic scale. How many different pitches do you think are in the octatonic scale based on 8? That's right. So we go from what's kind of like a standard of 7 different pitches. We go down to 6 for a whole tone scale. We come up to 8 pitches, different pitches for an octatonic scale. The octatonic scale is an 8-note scale constructed from a series of alternating half and whole steps. Alternating half and whole steps. So again, let's start one on C. And we'll go a half step above C and we get D flat. Then we have to go a whole step. We get E flat. Then a half step, we get E natural. Then a whole step, we would get F sharp. And a half step, we would get G. A whole step, we would get A. A half step, we would get B flat. And a whole step, we would get C. And we'll start. So, alternating half and whole steps, which will yield 8 different pitches, gives us the octatonic scale. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That does not count the octave release of the indicator pitch at the top. Alternating half and whole steps. The scale can be viewed, like the whole tone scale, it can be viewed as the juxtaposition of 2 different fully diminished 7th chords that interlock. Let's try this. I know it's faint, but you see the blue ones? F sharp, A, C, E flat. That's a fully diminished 7th chord. And then here's interlocking. The pitches that remain here, D flat, E, G, and B flat. That's a fully diminished 7th chord. E, G, B flat, B flat. So again, 2 interlocking, this time fully diminished 7th chords. Let me put the scale up here. By the way, if you know anything by the composer Stravinsky, he really liked the octatonics. Oh, a lot of composers did. But Stravinsky used it quite a bit as the source material for his music and composition. Alright, now the thing about the octatonic scale is this. The first step in the scale can either be a half step or a whole step. There's no rule. Just whatever you start with, then you have to alternate half steps and whole steps. Okay, so for instance, let me go. Let's just here. if I start an octatonic scale on C, I'm also allowed to and welcome to begin with the whole step rather than the half step. So I could go C to D, and then I could go half step from there, whole step from there, half step from there, whole step from there. And remember, any of these pitches could be spelled enharmonic. Let's see, whole step, half step from there, and then whole step from here is a B, and then half step from there is a C. 7, 8, yeah. So in this case, I'm alternating half and whole steps. It's just that I started with the whole step first this time. You can do either. And in your homework, when it asks you to spell an octatonic scale, I think it right after the scale name, in parentheses, it'll say whole step or half step. That tells you which interval to start with in your spell. Okay, tells you which interval to start with. Notice that the pitches we get out of this scale, even though we still start on C, are different than the pitches we get out of this scale. We started on C. And so it's a difference. It's a different octatonic scale. All right, because of the plethora of notes here, we have 8 different pitches. Every type of triad except for the augmented triad can be formed from the pitches of this scale. So in this scale, we can get major triads, we can get minor triads, and we can get diminished triads. But this time, no augmented triads, which we could get in the whole tone scale. Every common type of 7th chord except for the major 7th can be constructed from the pitches of this scale. So in terms of 7th chords, we can get the major minor 7th, we can get the minor 7th, we can get the half diminished 7th, and we can get the full diminished 7th, but not the major 7th. Is there anything else I want to say about this octatonic scale? I don't want to be as dry as dust and bore you to death, but this is just some factual information about scales that we need to get through. And then towards the end of class, then we'll do some examples out of the book, and you'll be able to see then what kinds of questions you're going to be getting on homework. I don't have really anything else that I need to say about the octatonic scale. If I forgot something, I'm sure it'll come up in the exercises or practice examples that we'll be waiting. Okay, so there you have that. Any questions about that scale? Yeah. Yeah, in this case, I would say, in this case, I would say that because we started it and ended it on C, that we could say that it is quote-unquote the tonic, or, you know, in modal scales, we use the term it's the final, that kind of thing. Yeah, but these scales, depending on how the composers use them, they really start to hide and obscure the sense of tonality and the sense of a pitch being more important than others when you use them as source material compositions. Oh, and by the way, an octatonic scale can be spelled starting on any pitch. Starting on any pitch. All right, then let's go to the hexatonic scale. You got this? Can I erase this? Do you have some of this in your notes? Based on the name again, how many different pitches do you think make up a hexatonic scale? 6. Kind of like the whole tone scale, but it's constructed a little differently. I'll start building it on C. The hexatonic scale is a 6-note scale that contains an interval pattern as a series of alternating half steps and minor thirds. The interval pattern between pitches is alternating half steps and minor thirds. So for instance, C sharp, And a minor third above C sharp is E. And a half step above E is F. Then a minor third above F is A flat. Then a half step above A flat is A. And then a minor third above A is C. So here, the interval pattern between pitches is a half step, and then a minor third. Half step, minor third, half step, minor third.
Can this one switch just like the octatonic scale?
Yeah, it's similar to the octatonic scale in that it has an alternating interval pattern between the pitches, but the interval pattern that alternates in the octatonic scale is half steps and whole steps. This one is half steps and minor thirds.
Yeah, but are you able to do like a minor third and a half step?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I see what you're saying. I don't know what the book mentions that. Okay, it says its interval pattern can be viewed as a series of half-step minor third or minor third half-step succession. So it does look like you could go both ways. Okay. I just finished a few minutes ago saying that the whole tone scale is a 6-note scale. You can think of it as like two interlocking augmented triads that are a whole step apart. Well, the hexatonic scale is, again, two interlocking augmented triads, but they're just a half step apart. So again, very similar. And let me just show one view of these augmented triads. So C, E, and A flat, that's an augmented triad. Think of the A flat as G sharp if you want. The remaining notes, C sharp, F, and A natural, those form an augmented triad as well, F, A, C sharp. This time the two augmented triads are a half step apart rather than a whole step. And again, could I have spelled this A flat as a D sharp in the scale? Absolutely. Could I have spelled this C sharp as a D flat? You'll notice how sometimes in the hexatonic scale, and certainly in the octatonic scale, notice how sometimes two scale steps have the same letter meaning? That's not, we don't get that in regular major and minor scales or modal scales. But when you spell an octatonic scale especially, chances are somewhere in the middle of the scale you're going to have two pitches of the same letter mean. They're just going to be a half step apart. And that's okay. Oh. Anything I want to say about the hexatonic scale here? Nope. I don't think so. So let's start applying this knowledge now to some of the examples out of the book. And I don't know why, but I grabbed a textbook. I grabbed last edition's textbook rather than your current edition. All you got to do, if you have your textbook, is find self-test 26-1. I'm going to guess it's around page 470 something, but you guys can verify that for me. Self-test 26-1.
It's on 472.
472, thank you. I'm going to start with some of the problems in section C of the self-test. And I'll put them up here on the board as we go through them. Because we do have some time and I want you to get a fair amount of practice here. Okay, it says, taking the major pentatonic scale as a model, transpose C, D, E, G, and A, that pentatonic scale, so that it will begin respectively on each of the pitches indicated. In other words, They want us to spell a major pentatonic scale starting on D. At the top of this class, beginning of this class, we just said the major pentatonic scale uses scale degrees 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6 of the major scale. Okay, so think of a D major scale, because that's where we're starting. What's scale degree 2? E. What's scale degree 3? F sharp. What's scale degree 5? A. And what's scale degree 6? B. Boom. You just spell the major pentatonic scale starting on D. You didn't think you could do it, but. Another one, a major pentatonic scale starting on B flat. Here's C. Next pitch would be D. F. And finally, G. I'm going to squeeze the last one. A major pentatonic scale. I'm going to read what I said that. Starting on F sharp. G sharp would be scale degree 2, right? A sharp. C sharp. And finally, D sharp. That scale. Are there any white keys on the piano on this scale? One of the questions on the top, or the questions in the self-test say, which of these three transposed scales represents a black key pentatonic collection? Which one is it? It's all about keys. Any questions about how to spell those? Pentatonic. Need some more space here. Next problem asks you to spell two scales, both of which are whole tone scales. The first one they want you to spell it in bass clef. Starting with, looks like a B. Remember, it's permissible to mix sharps and flats in these scales. It's permissible to spell something a big and harmonic. Whole tone scale on B. Let's start calculating whole steps above there. A whole step above B is C sharp. A whole step above C sharp is D sharp. A whole step above D sharp is E sharp. But I don't know if I want to spell E sharp. What do we want to, okay, let's call it F. Is that okay? D sharp to F is a diminished third? Yeah, that's okay. Okay, a whole step above F, G, a whole step above that is A, and a whole step above that is the final pitch. This really isn't that difficult if you understand it in the Man, I use the entire staff just for one scale. Man, I gotta start writing smaller. Okay, one more. Go back. We'll do this one in treble clef. We're gonna start a whole tone scale on D. I'm gonna write smaller. A whole step above D is E. A whole step above that is F sharp. A whole step above that is D sharp. A whole step above that is A sharp. I'm going to just call it B flat. Just for funsies. A whole step above B flat is C, and a whole step above C is D. All right. There's only one other type of problem that I want to go through from the self-test that would be like some on your homework. And for that, I think I'm going to need to show it on the document. We're supposed to look at this melody and we're supposed to determine or find out what scale this melody is based on. What scale is that first melody based on? Oops. What would be a strategy or a way to find out what scale forms the basis of this melody? Okay, thank you. First of all, we're going to take a pitch inventory. In other words, I'm going to look through all the notes there. I'm going to list them. I'm going to list them in ascending order to try to make a scale. But how do I know what would be the wisest, which pitch should I start on when I start listing my pitches in ascending order? The last pitch. The last pitch is known as the final. We're going to assume that these melodies end on their tonic, so to speak. So the final pitch of a mode, this could be a mode, this could be a synthetic scale. The final pitch is the same as the first note or the tonic note of our scale. Okay. So the final for this first melody is E. What kind of F do we have? Yeah, you see the key signature? So the F over in this measure, really any F that you get would be F sharp. Okay, what kind of D? Just plain D. Do we have any A's? And do we have B's? Look at the accidentals on the C's. It's C sharp, D natural, and then that means we're back to E again. Now, with all the new scales we've learned, you might look at this and say, I don't know what this scale is. But let's count, first of all, the number of different pitches to eliminate some possibilities. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That means it's not one of those synthetic scales. It's not whole-tone, it's not octatonic, it's not hexatonic. It can't be pentatonic either. Right? That would be a silly, ridiculous answer. It's either got to be a major scale, a minor scale, or a mode. Because those are the only scales that we've learned that have 7 different pitches. So I'm looking at this, and it starts on E. It doesn't look like E major. It doesn't look like E minor. But it looks really close to E minor with one adjustment. Yeah, it looks like E minor with the 6th scale that we raised a half step. Right? Because E minor just has F sharp in its key sign. So, what mode is that? Dorian, yeah. And so my final answer for this is Dorian. You do not have to say that it's E Dorian. You can just write Dorian. The reason I say that is because I have students in the past and they'll get mixed up and they'll say something like that. It's A Dorian. I don't want to have to mark it. Yeah, just because they're not paying attention. That's what it is. Okay, so Dorian is the final answer. Now, you probably saw the next one, but let's do a pitch inventory of number 2. And I think this might be a sufficient example. What should I start spelling my scale and pitch inventory on? A D. See, there's some E flat. Is there an E natural? There's F. There's also F sharp. Okay, G sharp. A. B. C. And D. How many different pitches did I want? Are they in an alternating pattern of half step, whole step, or whole step, half step? Yellow, half, whole, half, whole, half, whole, half, whole. So what's the scale basis for this movement? questions about this? If you have your workbook, if you take it out, I want to give you a pointer or some hints for the homework. In your workbook, if you open up to page 275, let me see, well, actually, if you can go to 272 first. In section, oh, you're going to do all of section F. In section G, I say this on the assignment sheet, there's one scale on the left, it's called a Lydian-Mixolydian. Can you cross that one out? We're not going to do that. You do not have to spell that scale. Skipping ahead to page 274. In section H, I only have you do numbers 1 through 4. So on page 274, you can cross out number 5 and number 6. You don't have to do those. I'm not going to mess around with those. There's some weird scales the book talks about. We don't need to know. Finally, in section I, page 275 and 276, it asks you to find the scale that is the basis for these passages, musical passages. Somewhere in each of the passages, there is a note with an arrow pointing to it. That arrow is supposed to be your tonic, your final, your first pitch, where you take a pitch inventory. The arrow should point you to the first pitch when you start listing the notes in ascending order to form a scale. There is an arrow pointing to a note in each of those 3 examples, so use that as your starting pitch. And then the only other thing is, if you only find 5 notes in a scale, please do not try to fill in missing notes and just assume what they might be based on the piecing to it. If you only find 5 different notes in a scale, it's probably a pentatonic scale. Don't add in some missing notes in a whole and then create some kind of other scale. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff to do starting with section F on page 272 all the way through section I on 276. But pay attention to your assignment sheet. You don't have to do every one of those. And some of these should go real quick. Okay? Does anyone have any questions? All right, then that's summertime now. See you on Friday already. I got some emails, but I never did actually get the...
Okay, I usually don't know
What, AM or PM? I did get 2 emails from you. They were around the 5 o'clock hour, 6 o'clock hour. Okay. Yeah, I will. And you got the rest for the next.
Thank you.
Yep. Oh, in the middle of the scale? No, they typically don't do that. So they start with a pattern throughout the time, and then they go through that to get the rest of the notes for the scale. Well, when you say modulator, do you mean like change the integral pattern? Or do you mean like change pitches and go to different quote-unquote keys. Because there really are no keys when you deal with skills like this. It's just kind of a different role. We don't really talk about modulations in 20th century America. Either that or they use chromatic solfege, which was just all, everything was just chromatic and house. We'll hear some and see some more pieces in the future. Yep.